morning, comrades, or good night. Thank you for joining this session about Rosa Luxemburg. Yeah, we have a lot of stuff to cover today. As Celia already said, we are splitting the lead off in 4 different parts, but just the 2 of us. So I will start with the use of Rosa Luxemburg and her first political activities, especially around the national question. Then Sarah will continue with her role in the Second International. And then after that, me again, with her fight against the war and the German Revolution. And then closed by Sarah about Rosa's position on the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution. And then she will do the sum up as well. So as a brilliant Marxist, but also as a Jewish woman from Poland, obviously Rosa Luxemburg had a lot of haters, and I will quote some of them. But I can't quote all of them, it's too many. For example, the Austrian Social Democrat Viktor Adler called her a hysterical woman, a doctrinaire goose, a toxic, devious woman. Some tried to distort her ideas and to lie about her beliefs after she was killed. There's a lot of misinterpretation about her ideas. But it was also Lenin who described her as an eagle, and the Marxist historian Franz Mehring once said about her that she was the best brain since Marx. So today we will have a deeper look into her life and her ideas as a revolutionary. And now I will start with her use time and her work around the national question. Yeah, as said before, Rosa Luxemburg was born in 1871 to liberal Jewish parents in what is today southeastern Poland. She enjoyed a very good education in Warsaw, but used her time at school already to join illegal revolutionary clubs and Marxist reading cycles. It was because of that she had to get away from Poland shortly after her exams and moved to Zurich in Switzerland to visit the university. This is where she immediately joined the exile scene of revolutionaries living there of all kinds. These people were often very much involved in building the workers' movements in their countries, publishing papers, developing theories and programs. Also, Rosa decides in Zurich to dedicate her life to the revolution. Meanwhile, in Paris, in 1892, the Polish Socialist Party, the PPS, gets founded. Here, Luxemburg meets her lifetime enemy, nationalism and the workers' movement. At this point in history, a united Poland does not exist since 1815. It's divided into a Habsburg Austrian part in the south, a Tsarist Russian part in the east, and the Prussian German part in the west, as you can see on the map. But it gets much more complicated than that. Beside the Polish majority, there are many minorities, some of them really huge. There's, for example, Ruthenians, which is today Ukrainians or Belarusians, Germans, Silesians, Lemke people, and many, many more. Around 10% of the population has a Jewish background. A majority of at least the more wealthy liberal Jews associate themselves as Polish nationals, like Rosa's parents, for example, but are confronted with a growing anti-Semitism inside the Polish national movement. As a consequence, in the late 19th century, Zionism is on the rise in all 3 parts of Poland. This adds again to the many contradictory national movements in Poland at the time. This is a major complicating factor in building the workers' movement and class unity. The Polish Socialist Party, in their Paris exile, raised the demand for a unified bourgeois democratic Polish national state and understands itself as one party for all 3 parts of Poland. Luxemburg can see this is not a solution for the national question at all, but just another source of division along national lines between the workers. So she takes up a fight against that position, and as an answer to the foundation of the PPS, she and others published Sprawa Robotnicza, which is Workers' Cause, from July in 1893 on forward. So this fight around the national question gets real on the Second Congress of the Second International in August 1893, so just 1 month after founding that paper, where she's a delegate for that freshly founded paper. She argues against the one party for 3 parts of Poland position of the PPS. So she said in that Congress, rather than a working class organized in accordance with political realities, there would be an espousal of organization along national lines, which often goes astray from the start. Instead of political programs, nationalist programs would be drawn up. Instead of coherent political struggle of the proletariat in every country, its disintegration through a series of fruitless national struggles would be virtually assured. So she argues there is no solution for the Polish national question in capitalism at all, and that socialists should not spread illusions about that. The tactical argument is that the political program needs to be put before the national program. She continues that the Polish economy is so deeply integrated into the economies of either Austria, Russia, or Germany that a united Poland would not mean progress towards industrialization, but just regression. The working class should unite with the working classes of the occupying states instead of wasting time with trying to unify Poland. She loses that fight at the Congress against the PPS delegates and even gets the delegation revoked, but she does not capitulate, but immediately after the Congress found, with others of course, a socialist party for the Russian occupied part of Poland, the social democracy of the Kingdom of Poland, that joins the Second International as a separate section. So now a socialist politician in the Russian Empire, she joins the debates about the national question inside the Russian social democracy. The Russian socialists take up the demand, as we do in the ISA today, the right of nations to self-determination. But she is very critical of that slogan. So she argues, quote, "The national question cannot be settled by the use of some vague cliché, even such a fine-sounding formula as the right of all nations to self-determination. For such a formula expresses either absolutely nothing, so it is an empty, non-committal phrase, or else it expresses the unconditional duty of socialists to support all national aspirations, in which case it's simply false." And further, sorry, in a word, the formula, the right of nations to self-determination, is essentially not a political and problematic guideline in the nationality question, but only a means of avoiding that question. For her, it's not a practical solution at all. What is that slogan even supposed to mean for nations that share the same space in the same states? And on top of that, she argues for many nations, even if it would be possible, would it be a good idea, a good thing to have them independent from other nations? So she writes, "If the national liberation of Poland is elevated to a political goal of the international proletariat, why not also the liberation of Czechoslovakia, Ireland, or Alsace-Lorraine? All these objectives are equally utopian and are no less justified than the liberation of Poland." So congratulations to the Irish, you live in utopia. She makes that point that with the capitalist imperialist development that there are dependencies of many countries in their progress from the imperialist nations. So if we support a nation's fight for independence, it must not be a general abstract principle, but it should be decided for each individual case. So as a good counterexample for the Russian slogan, she quotes of all things the national program of the Austrian social democracy in their Brünner Programm from 1899. So regarding the national question, the program states, "Austria is to be transformed into a democratic federation of nationalities. The historic crown lands are to be replaced by a nationally homogeneous self-ruling bodies whose legislation and administration shall be in the hands of national chambers, elected on the basis of universal, equal, and direct franchise." The key word here is crown lands instead of nations. So this follows the national politics of the Habsburg Empire. In practice, this would, for example, of Poland, recognize a right for a Polish nation, but demand subordinations of Ruthenian, Silesian Jews living in Poland under that Polish nationality. Of course, Rosa can see that, but she argues the Austrians took care of that in their program as well. So this quote is again from the Brünner Programm. But because the nationalities are to some extent jumbled together through almost the entire area of Austria, the program of social democracy makes provisions for a special law to protect smaller minorities in the newly created national territories. But at least to me, this is very abstract. If you negate somebody's rights that are very important to them, they will not listen to you if you say you protect their other rights. This does not lead to Luxemburg's demand of political, to put political programs in front of national programs, but quite the opposite. So the implementation of the Brunner Programm in Galicia, the Habsburg part of Poland, had very strong consequences. The Ruthenians split from the main Polish Socialist Party, and on the other hand, nationalism grew inside that main Polish Socialist Party. This was also shown in a rise of anti-Semitism inside the Polish Socialist Party. So, for example, the Polish Socialist Party took up the demand from the bourgeois Polish national movement for the Jews to assimilate in the higher Polish nation. This again led to the foundation of the Poale Zion, the Workers of Zion, a Zionist socialist party that soon organized the majority of Jewish workers in Galicia. So then again, the Polish Socialist Party moved to dissolve all Jewish sub-organizations inside the party and forbid any publications of the party in Yiddish, which left the Jewish anti-Zionists inside the Polish Socialist Party. It left them no choice but to also form their own party. So I hope this wasn't too hard to follow, but as the result of the Brunner Programm in Galicia, at least, was to have 4 instead of 1 socialist party and an even more divided working class. For us, it is clear that in order to have solidarity and any joint struggle at all, you need to have as much equality of rights in the party as possible. But if I demand something from you, which I am not willing to give to you myself, in this case, the abandonment of your national aspirations, I declare you less important than me. Luxemburg declared that as Marxists, we should be against the slogan, the right of nations to self-determination, as we are against all eternal truth and dogmas. This cannot be one slogan for all times, all places. But the Bolsheviks did not treat this slogan as such. For them, it was a demand in the spirit of transitional demands in a time where national oppression was a main pillar of many regimes all over the world, especially in Russia or Austria. Having a right to choose is the requirement for voluntarily joining a union with other nations, but granting a right is not the same thing as approving of its use. So when the Soviet Union was founded in 1922, it was the free choice of the many nations in the former empire to join it. They choose so because they had a very good reason to join that first socialist state and had the experience of the joint struggle of all the nations against the counter-revolution. Rosa remains valiant inside the Second International. She fights the big men of her time, the most celebrated socialist figures. But more about this now from Sarah.
Thanks, Till. Hi, comrades. So Luxembourg's role in the Second International was outstanding and can't be stressed enough. Until the end, when the Second International capitulated and declined, she was one of the leading figures of the left revolutionary wing, arguing energetically against reformist and centrist tendencies. So Luxembourg moved to Germany in 1897, and in order to obtain the German citizenship, she married Gustav Lübke, and she moved to Berlin and immediately joined the Social Democratic Party, the SPD. She was a brilliant speaker, and so she quickly gained prestige within the SPD. So what was the political situation within the social democracy? In 1890, after 12 years, in Germany, the so-called Sozialistengesetze, the laws which had banned the social democracy, were repealed. And as a result, the SPD won more seats in the elections. And most of the representatives wanted to keep this new legality and their privilege, and thus turned away from revolutionary politics. So, for example, the program from 1891 is an expression of how the socialist revolution was only seen as a theoretical goal and was separated from the day-to-day struggle for social reforms. In 1898, Luxemburg intervened for the first time in this so-called revisionism debate, and in the weeks that followed, she published a series of articles against Edward Bernstein's theory. This later became one of her most important pieces, which is Reform or Revolution, and is still, a rich defense of Marxism. The period of economic boom across Europe had its effect on the workers' movement and on the SPD, fostering the development of a strong opportunist tendency, as I said, and one of the leading figures of this was Edward Bernstein. Bernstein argued that due to credit, capitalism had adopted itself and that economic crisis was less and less likely. He argued that with trade unions and cooperatives, one could gradually reform capitalism until a socialist society. Luxemburg sharply attacked this idea and wrote that the credit system actually provokes overproduction and that economic crisis is produced by capitalism because of the system itself. So today, looking at the crisis of capitalism and its nature, we know how correct she was and how absurd Bernstein's theory. Luxemburg describes very precisely the relationship between reform and revolution. And this is highly up to date when we look at all the left reformist figures and parties in the last years and today, from Syriza to Bernie Sanders, which weren't able to offer any alternative to the working class to get out of the crisis of capitalism. Luxemburg argued for every struggle, for every reform to improve the living and working conditions of the working class. But she also did that in order to raise socialist consciousness within the masses, to learn from struggles, and for arguing that in order to keep these improvements, the working class needs to fight to take over power. 1 year after Luxemburg wrote Reform or Revolution in 1899, the French socialist Mitterrand joined the Waldeck-Rousseau government in France as a minister. Luxemburg's analysis on what she saw as tasks for socialists in the parliament and in relation to the government was key in this debate on the so-called socialist crisis in France. Luxemburg argued in an article in July 1899 the role of the social democracy in bourgeois society is essentially that of an opposition party. It can only enter on scene as a government party on the ruins of bourgeois society. The question of socialists participating in government was and is often in German, you say Gretchenfrage, like the key question for the working class movement. Luxemburg saw very clearly that there can't be any illusion in so-called left governments. She described how socialist participation in government actually brings fewer concrete improvements and not more, because it forces the socialist parties to gloss over the government's policies and weakens the pressure on the government from below. Of course, there's an important difference between Luxemburg's time when there had been powerful organizations of the working class and the situation today. But still, she experienced similar problems in bringing the class struggle forward. Deeply inspired by the Russian Revolution in 1905, and after she had analyzed that mass strikes had been the main way of how the struggle had been conducted, she advocated mass strikes in Germany to fight for reforms. Sorry. And she was blocked by the right wing within the SPD and the trade union leaders. And I can't go deeper into this mass strike debate, but it's very important for today. The reformists argued that the trade unions were not strong enough and that only a minority of the working class is organized within the unions, and therefore mass strikes could not take place. This argument was heavily attacked by Luxemburg, and she said the political mass strike is the natural way for the broadest proletarian layers to get into action and to organize themselves, actually. And she also countered the idea of separating the struggle in the workplaces from political struggles, and said that it's one class struggle. The leadership of the SPD and the trade unions prevented the use of the mass strike, even tried to ban the discussion on it, with the result that the working class had to learn the use of this kind of struggle later under much more difficult conditions. Just one last point on that. When you read the mass strike, one could say that she maybe exaggerated the idea of the spontaneity of the masses. And it's true that she stresses that a lot and maybe too much, but this was not because she didn't see the role of the party, but because the leaders of the Social Democratic Party actually exaggerated the role of the party. So in general, the most important disputes within the Second International and the socialist parties revolved around basically the definition of the principles of political class struggle and the principles of socialist policies. And although Luxemburg and her revolutionary comrades were able to win some successes on these questions against revisionism and reformism on paper, this didn't stop the social democracy and the Second International from degenerating, and Till will continue with that.
Yeah. After years of fighting the rising militarism in many countries all over the world, the Congress of the Second International in 1911 adopts the following resolution. The German, Spanish, English, Dutch, and French delegates of the workers' organizations declare to be ready to fight every declaration of war with all available means. At this point, the workers' movement is stronger than ever. This movement is the one to break militarism. There's talk of organizing an international strike on the day a war would be declared on day X. Many hope if the ruling class decides to go to war, the workers' movement will not only prevent them from doing so, but bring them down altogether. Many feel this might be the dawn of revolution. And even 1 week before the declaration of war in 1914, the German social democracy calls on the workers in their publications to stand against the war. But then, I just read the following. In the era of danger, we will not let our fatherland down. We feel in accordance with the international that supports at all time the right of all peoples for national independence and self-defense. Led by these principles, we approve the demanded war loans. Declaration of the Reichstag Club of the SPD in the 4th of August in 1914. For internationalists all over the world, this is the darkest hour of the workers' movement. Has all the work been in vain? Have all the sacrifices been for nothing? What happened to the most powerful organization that ever existed at that point, the Socialist International? For Rosa, it must have felt the same, but she does not hesitate. Already for the very same evening of that sad declaration of the Parliamentary Club, she invites comrades to her flat to organize the resistance. At this evening, 6 people are the spark of the new Gruppe Internationale, the Group International. They send out a call to Social Democrats to oppose the party leadership but at first got only very little support. Starting December 1914, they sent out propaganda letters to a growing number of recipients, soon to be known as the Spartacus letters. The conditions for that under wartime repression and with no support from party resources were extremely difficult. It's not an overestimation to state that Rosa became the starting point for the organized socialist resistance against the war in Germany. Many give Karl Liebknecht that honor, but at this first vote on the war loans, he voted with the majority in order to not to break party discipline. Only after the support he feels from the Gruppe Internationale, he famously voted against the second round of war loans. In April 1915, even though published only in 1916, she writes one of her most important texts, the so-called Junius pamphlet. There, she not only destroys the myth of the self-defense war for the imperialist power struggle that it was, but also gives important guidelines to socialists everywhere on how to proceed. It's still a very inspiring read. There she shows again one of her most distinguishing features, not to capitulate and surrender to depression and cynicism, but to continue the fight no matter what. At first, the Gruppe Internationale remains inside the SPD. They hope to gain more influence over the rank and file membership. But wartime is not a good time to build a new organization. Not only Liebknecht, but also Luxemburg spent most of the remainder of the war in prison. Rosa manages somehow to stay informed and smuggle and out articles for the Spartacus letters. At the Zimmerwald Conference of 1915, where the leadership of the remaining internationalists meets and formulates a program against the war, Rosa is there as well, shortly before she gets arrested for the rest of the war. Also there from Germany are a number of SPD members of parliament that are also against the war, but not willing to vote against it in order not to break party unity. Later, when these guys get expelled from the SPD for their muffled opposition, they found the so-called independent SPD, the USPD, in early 1917. Since this split is so obviously about the war, many of the best and most militant Social Democrats joined this new party. And so does Rosa Luxemburg and the Gruppe Internationale, now known as Spartacus. But they state openly that they joined the USPD as an organized group to influence party politics. They know that the leadership of the USPD is extremely hesitant and not the leadership the workers' movement now needs. In my opinion, it's the right choice for Spartacus, and they gain more influence, but they still remain small and not very visible. They are able to play a role in the strike against Liebknecht's arrests in June 1916, but it's only in Berlin. But the more nationwide strikes in April 1917 and January 1918 can only be commentated by Spartacus and have because they have an even more spontaneous character. But with even more enthusiasm, Rosa joined the German Revolution. It's a literal liberation for her. On the very day the Republic is proclaimed, she gets released from prison. The workers' and soldiers' councils develop fast. In Bavaria, already a Soviet-style democracy is in place. Rosa, of course, supports the call for a Reichsrätekongress, the nationwide Congress of Council Delegates that meets in December 1918. She recognizes it as a true and legitimate source of power. They should lay the basis for socialist democracy in Germany and support other revolutions, foremost the Russian one. She develops the programs the Spartacus group intervenes with on the Congress. Disarmament of the police and all members of the ruling classes, armament of the proletariat and the building of the Red Guard, takeover of all local and state councils by freely elected workers and soldiers' councils, transfer of all banks, mines, steel mills, and big factories into people's property, connecting to all foreign brother parties for an internationalization of the revolution. But instead of that program, the SPD-dominated Congress disempowers itself. It calls for an election for a national assembly where the new bourgeois democracy is to be constituted. Rosa, of course, is frustrated over that defeat, but not for long. With the new paper, The Red Flag, Die Rote Fahne, she calls for the foundation of a new revolutionary workers' party. At New Year's Eve, this party, the KPD, gets founded. KPD, of course, is the Communist Party of Germany. One has to say it was founded sadly too late. I don't think there was a better moment to break with the USPD and to unify the revolutionary left, but still, the KPD cannot play the role in the Bolsheviks did in Russia. Ultra-leftism is a childhood disease, and this goes for the KPD as well. Both Rosa and Karl fought against the call for a National Assembly at the Congress of the Council Delegates, but now they argue for the KPD to stand in these elections. Many workers put their hopes in that assembly, and of course they do, because their very own Congress called for that. To leave that future battleground to the right wing would be wrong. But Rosa and Karl lose this vote at the KPD Congress, and the KPD calls for a boycott of the elections. When in early January another workers' uprising starts, Rosa again joins it and rallies new hope. But now the SPD government crushes this uprising with determined violence. With that support for them, the counter-revolutionary far-right moves beyond that. Now they want to root out the revolutionary left leaders. On the 15th of January, nationalist paramilitary forces allied to the Social Democrats arrest Rosa, smash her head with a rifle butt, shoot her, and later drown her. The ruling class feared Rosa so much they killed her 3 times. But of course, Rosa's story continues, and Sarah is going to cover that.
I'll try to keep the last part short because we already talked so much. After her death, Luxemburg's ideas were often misused until today. Reformists and bourgeois historians try to portray her as the sharpest critique of Lenin, Trotsky, and the Bolsheviks. Especially her work from 1918 on the Russian Revolution is often misinterpreted and instrumentalized. Luxemburg's essay was written in prison in 1918 and cut off from regular information. She recognized the enormous importance of the Russian Revolution. In the first chapter, she defends the October Revolution and the policies of the Bolsheviks under Lenin and Trotsky against criticism from the right and reformists. She, for example, answered this idea that it was a mistake to start the socialist revolution in a country like Russia and wrote, the fact that the Bolsheviks based their policy entirely on the world revolution of the proletariat is precisely the most brilliant testimony of their political foresight and their fundamental firmness, the boldness of their policy. Luxemburg's critique of some aspects of the Bolsheviks' policies, like on the Constituent Assembly, for example, and democracy, must be read as a comradely contribution. Actually, her essay was not published until 1922, after her death, by her former lawyer, Paul Levy, in order to use that for misinterpretation, actually. Clara Zetkin, for example, reported that Luxemburg had changed her mind about the Russian Revolution and the politics of the Bolsheviks on important issues. In her, she wrote, like Zetkin wrote, for example, in her further correspondence, Luxemburg, spoke of this matter as settled and never returned to it later. The why is obvious to anyone familiar with Rosa Luxemburg's activity after the outbreak of the German Revolution. This activity is characterized by a position on the problems of the constituent, democracy, dictatorship, etc., which is in contradiction to the earlier criticism of Bolshevik policy. Luxemburg had come to a changed historical evaluation. Sorry for the long quote. Zetkin was deeply correct with this analysis. Luxemburg was in fact fighting for the same thing as the Bolsheviks in Russia and in the German November Revolution. And because of her experience in the last months of her life, she became, like Zetkin said, ever more Bolshevik. Zetkin described this very impressively by saying theory was for the moment overtaken by practice and debate by struggle. So I'll try to come to an end, comrade, sorry. Maybe one important quote from Luxemburg about the Russian Revolution is the following. The Bolsheviks have shown that they're capable of everything that a genuine revolutionary party can contribute within the limits of historical possibilities. They are not supposed to perform miracles. And she continues, for a model and faultless proletarian revolution in an isolated land exhausted by world war, strangled by imperialism, betrayed by the international proletariat would be a miracle. So to come to an end, Luxemburg dedicated her whole life for the struggle for international socialism. She made mistakes and corrected them, and she was able to transfer Marxism to new situations, and she was a fighter. And she wrote, you know, man must always be like a candle burning at both ends. And I think this is, like, also personally for all of us can be a deep inspiration for today. Thanks, comrades.